Okay, so we've done a form-based authentication, and as I said in the lecture, that works really well if you're creating an application and you want to style your login form according to the rest of your application. That doesn't work so well for API endpoints that we want to secure, because obviously in order for a web client, a web API client, to understand your form login, it would have to understand the various HTML elements on your form, which means it's not amenable to that. So what we want to do is to use HTTP basic authentication, but only on our our API endpoints. So we'd like to use form authentication for the parts of our app which the end user sees, but we'd like to use basic authentication for the parts of our app which are API calls that other systems can make. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a controller in our application, and we're going to create a controller called auth test API, which is where we're going to implement a pseudo RESTful service. Okay, so there's my create controller auth test API, and you can see it's generated all these files. Let's have a quick look at the controller. And I've suggested in the worksheet if we just implement the index method. So we'll import the converters so that we can send back some JSON, and then here we've got just some sample code that sends back a JSON object. Obviously this would be real data in a real application, but for now we're going to settle for just sending back this JSON document which has some info and some properties in it. So if we just save that, let's run that. Okay, so that's started up. We go back to auth test now, and obviously we haven't secured this yet, so we go to auth test API and we get back our JSON object. That's good. Of course we want it to be secured, so let's stop the application, and what I'll do is just realised we need to import this, so just make sure that goes in the notes as well, and we need to use the annotation. Okay, so we import the secured annotation. There we go, and then we use that annotation on our method that we want to secure. There it is. So we're now saying that you need to be an authenticated user who has the admin role in order to access this service. And we but what we need to do is we need this URL to be authenticated using basic authentication, because it's going to be our API endpoint. We don't want a form to be popped up. We want to use the built-in HTTP mechanism for sending an authentication challenge back to the client. So what we'll do is, in order to do this, we need to make a change to Grails app config.groovy, and what we need to do is to add some configuration at the bottom. So here are the 3 lines which configure the classes that are used, the domain classes used for users' roles, and the link between users and roles. And we're just going to copy this stanza into this document, and this says, I'll explain it in a second. By default, use basic authentication, and when you send a basic authentication challenge, use the role name auth test. So this you could change to be any text you wanted to appear in the pop-up dialog. And then we say, but I want to be able to configure URLs specifically, and specifically for auth test API, that's going to be my default. And because the default is to use basic authentication, that's how we're going to make sure that basic auth is used for the API. And for everything else, let's go back to using form-based authentication by taking the basic authentication filter out. So it's a little bit back to front, and it's a negation, but what we're doing is we're making the default authentication mechanism basic, and we're making the authentication mechanism used for this specific service, the default is basic, and then the specific service we're going to use for user interface parts is form-based authentication. Sorry, got myself in knots there. So we've made that change, that's good. So we'll do a run app. Okay, so there's auth test, and what I'll do is if I